In 1990, I read an article in the Washington Times about how Congress and then President Bush were debating forcing oil companies to add a chemical to gasoline and diesel fuel that gives 20% more mileage with 70% less pollution, which is nothing more than a cheap polymer that takes less than 2 drops per gallon to work. Mileage wasn't much of an issue back then because gas was so cheap. But I lived next to the Capitol Beltway and had been noticing the taste of blood in my throat sometimes when I went jogging. So I liked the idea of cleaner air in my neighborhood. But the oil companies refused to use it. After that, all evidence that this additive existed disappeared. In the year 2000, the Washington Times ran another article about it, but no one paid any attention to it. After the price of gasoline started going through the roof a couple years ago, I happened to bring it up in a forum about how this additive was supposed to work. No one, however, believed that there could be anything to such a story saying that if there was something like that worked, it would already be used. So I went looking for evidence to either prove or disprove that this additive works. What I found was astounding, especially as the EPA still claims there is no way to make gasoline or diesel fuel more efficient. This additive was actually invented here in the 11th District of Virginia in Gainesville, around where Route 29 and 66 cross each other. It was discovered by a little company working on a jet fuel additive that would prevent jet fuel from catching fire so easily. The articles I read in 1990 said that the patent for the additive was owned by the military and would take 10 years for it to be available for public use. That's what the debate in 1990 was about, getting the oil companies to agree to use it, where then George Bush could waive the red tape so it could be put to use immediately. But the oil companies refused, and it was gone without a trace, until I came across a mention about the name of a company, GTA Tech, and an article about an additive that claimed to give these same benefits being used in Texas. So I found the website for this additive, where lo and behold, the owner was the same guy who previously owned GTA Tech, Jerry Tripp. The incredible thing was that the article where I found the clue that provided the link to solving the mystery of what happened to this additive was telling how it was being used by the state of Texas and the municipal diesel truck fleet to comply with EPA air quality standards. It seems the region was heavily polluted by refineries, so they decided to use this additive to get pollution levels down. They had reached out to GTA Tech, who moved out west to become the company named Viscon, and it's been tested and certified by the Texas Environmental Protection Agency as being safe and effective. Later, California tested and certified it as well. They, however, made no mention of its fuel economy benefits, just that it does indeed provide a lessening of emissions. Since the pollution byproducts of fossil fuels are simply chemicals with fuel potential that doesn't combust upon ignition, any additive that provides lesser emissions could only do it by giving better mileage. I found it odd that there was no mention about it giving better mileage in the articles about it being used in Texas or in the test results. So I went to the website for Viscon, where I found that they still claim that it does give this greater mileage as I had remembered reading about. Of course, it all started to make sense after I thought about it. The oil companies have no interest in selling us gasoline or diesel fuel that gives 20% more mileage because they're interested in selling us 20% more gallons of fuel we're currently wasting. That, however, doesn't answer why Congress and the first Bush president didn't force them to do it in 1990, which is as our environmental laws required that they should have done. But since oil companies have a lot of money and power they buy with that money, they can do pretty much anything they want. That is, provided we don't know too much about it. I remember how the articles talked about how much environmentalist groups were pushing to get this done. But then after a $268 million slush fund was set up for them to use at their convenience, they walked away from the issue. That's how things work, or don't work, here in Washington, D.C. Is that freedom? I don't call that freedom. It's tyranny pretending to be freedom. I love freedom, and I hate tyranny. I don't have a word of disgust that adequately describes how I feel about tyrants who hide what they are. Perverts, I guess, would be in the ballpark. I'm sure many of our esteemed leaders in Washington would find that comment highly inappropriate coming from a candidate for Congress. But then they will probably dismiss my campaign as being irrelevant no matter what I say, thinking there's no way you would want to listen to what I have to say or how they spin the truth. I guess on this issue, it all comes down to how much you want cleaner, more efficient fuel to run in your vehicles. The other issues I addressed are just as important to your future. And you don't need to elect me to get any of this done either. Simply know about them so they can't lie to you about it anymore. It doesn't matter how crooked they are if they can't get away with lying to you. Anyway, so the oil companies were willing to use this additive in Texas as long as they didn't advertise that it gave better mileage. The thing is that this polymer additive, a long form of polyisobutylene, is refined from fossil fuels just like gasoline and diesel fuel is. Polyisobutylene is used in just about everything we buy these days, in plastics and explosives, even as a food additive that's used in making bubble gum chewy. In fact, it's already added to gasoline in a shorter form to help keep it from evaporating, or rather, it's simply refined into it. So really what this additive demonstrates is that gasoline and diesel fuel can be refined to give at least 20% more mileage while causing 70% less pollution with just a few tweaks at the refinery. And the government and oil companies have known about this for 20 years. This means that the world could have 20% more fossil fuels with a slight alteration of the production process while eliminating 70% of the pollution coming from cars and trucks. In my research into these astounding revelations, I came across a chat forum where additives to gasoline were being discussed. They had come across the Washington Times article from 2000 and went looking for the additive to see if it worked. They had found GTA Tech before the company was dissolved to become Viscon, but didn't like the high price being asked for the additive. So they tracked down the patent and also found a cheap 2-cycle engine oil additive that was the same chemical that they could buy at a fraction of the cost that GTA Tech was selling it for. Then they came up with a formula based on the patent for how much of it to add to gasoline. They claimed that it worked, so I got some. And indeed it does. The point of telling this story is not to portray this as an issue I can get behind if elected. Like my other issues, if the truth gets out about what's really going on, change will come long before the election. It doesn't take big government to force the oil industry to give us better fuel. Our government is where great things go to be hidden from the American people. If government could make things work, we would already have cleaner burning, higher mileage producing fossil fuels in our cars and trucks right now. What happened was that something that looked like a great idea was taken where it would seem logical to get support for using it, to our elected officials. That was the last that was seen of it here in Washington, D.C. In fact, the story was only covered by the lowly circulated Washington Times, a paper owned by the head of the Moonies cult, Reverend Sun Myung Moon, not a paper like those owned by Wall Street banks, like all the other major newspapers who sell news out of Washington, whose corporate heads wouldn't want a story like this to be told to the American people. So it was a fluke that I read about and remembered it, then later found myself in a position to expose the truth about it. Many of the other issues I addressed were born through this same process. Reading the Washington Times and Washington Post every day back to back before the Washington Times was initiated into the inner political circle around Washington, where now it reports in concert with everyone else. But back then, all I used to have to do to find out what was being lied about in Washington was read both papers and take note of what was only being reported on in the Washington Times. To support my campaign, all you have to do is know the issues I support, like how this additive gives these great benefits and how our gasoline and diesel fuel can be refined to produce these same results. Once enough of you know this fact, the dominoes will begin to tumble into each other until we have cleaner, more efficient burning fossil fuels. In the end, I'll get credit for my role in helping make this come about, which may lead to my getting elected over the other candidates who are members of the parties who've been lying about this all along. If I'm elected, you'll be sending a representative from your district to Washington, D.C. who knows more about how they do business than they do and isn't afraid to expose the truth about it. If I'm not elected, my campaign can still be a total success, as my only intention for running is to get the word out about things like this additive that have been stolen from us that I want given back. Now, not after I'm elected, but now.